coming, and thank you also to Krish for the invitation to attend, and the Stanford Archaeology Centre for facilitating this visit. I want to begin by explaining my title, especially the phrases silences and mentions. And this is because late last year I was attending a meeting that was discussing Scandinavian involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. And I was roundly criticised when, during a discussion, I used this phrase. So I'm a little bit sensitive about it, and I want people to be quite clear what I mean. And the gist of the criticism was along the lines, slaves had voices too. And I quite agree. My point in using the concept of silences and mentions was not indeed to deny agencies, the slaves having any agency. I was using it very much in a specific sense. And we have to be conscious also in any discussion of the archaeology and history of the Indian Ocean post AD 1500, following the arrival of European powers and actors. We need to be diligent with regard to just whose voice we give primacy to in our historical narratives, and that's something that Krish mentioned in his introduction. So to be clear, my use of these terms is drawn, as many of you will recognize, from the late Michel Rolfe-Trio's study of the historiography of the Haitian Revolution between 1791 and 1804. And in this wonderful text, he makes the points about the silences existing both in terms of the making of sources, in the creation of archives, in the narration of stories, and also not all voices are included in the production of history. And as many scholars have emphasized in the wake of Foucault, colonial archives in particular became expressions of imperial desires to master the world, discursive formations that made manifest the categories and the operations of the state itself. So exploring how the archives were compiled and constituted can thus inform us about the process of colonialism itself as well. And I think that should be, if we're thinking about setting agendas here for research on the Indian Ocean, in using the concept of archives in a very loose sense and not just paper archives in that sense, I think that would be one direction that we ought to be looking at. What are the sources? Why are those sources the sources that we rely on? Why have they left? What types of gaps have they left in not only in our knowledge of specific processes and events, but also how we construct a historical narrative of the Indian Ocean world. So archives in this sense are less static places where facts lie waiting to be rescued, but places of the recurrent regrouping and transformation of facts through ongoing ruination and fragment accumulation. And I think we can use that sort of metaphor. I think that metaphor fits very well for our understanding of what constitutes an archaeological archive as well. Now, my knowledge of the archaeology of the Indian Ocean world post-1500 primarily concerns the western part of the Indian Ocean. And in this talk I shall focus mostly on East Africa and parts of the Red Sea and some of the offshore islands. So there in itself is a silencing as well, and a particular kind of mentioning. With regard to the archaeology of the East African coast, key among some of the issues has been the idea that the stone-built port cities and towns of the Swahili coast were founded by princely Arab merchants from Shiraz in southwest Iran, not African communities themselves. This is a view that is held by a small section of East African coastal society who were politically and economically powerful at the time British colonial rule was established. And their claims met with colonial European preconceptions of the abilities and accomplishments of African societies. And such ideas certainly shaped the interpretation of the archaeological record for several decades, when archaeologists began to turn their attention to the Swahili stone-walled sites. But since the 1980s, archaeological research combined with historical and historical linguistic studies have done much to challenge such an interpretation. And the balance of opinion is that these towns were local foundations with local origins, even though their contacts extended widely around the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, including the Persian Gulf. And we have a much more sophisticated understanding of the interactions and flows of information and expertise around the Indian Ocean and with which East African communities were engaged, at least from the classical era and likely somewhat earlier as well. So there, in a sense, there has been a shift, or there has been a deep debunking of the colonial archive, if you like. But as many of you know, that there have also been some more recent criticisms that some of the research that has helped debunk older colonial interpretations of East African coastal archaeology remains trapped by the legacies of the colonial archive, and especially the work of certain, and here that critique, if you like, is often directed at the work of certain foreign researchers. Now, personally, I find many of these arguments rather disingenuous. To be sure, some of those researchers who make such arguments have provided very valuable and important new information concerning the antiquity of links between coastal settlements and communities further in the interior, and on the nature of such exchanges and their scale and direction. So there is indeed, they have, through their archaeological fieldwork, have certainly shown us, provided substantive information about the direction and scale of links between the coast and the interior. That I have no problem with, but finding such material evidence for the first time is very different, I think, from demonstrating that other scholars never allowed for the possibility that such evidence might exist. Maybe this is just a debate that really only refers to those of us who work in East Africa, but some of you may gather what I'm going on with. So let me turn now to the substance of my talk, in which I'll focus on aspects of the archaeology of the last 500 years or so. In other words, from AD 1498, when Vasco da Gama and his companions became the first Europeans in the post-medieval era to enter in the Indian Ocean. And as I said, my focus is going to be on the African case material. And I make no claim that either the framework I offer will fit as readily in other parts of the Indian Ocean. However, I hope that some generic insights may be drawn from this overview that do have relevance for thinking about how we might study the post-AD 1500 archaeology of other parts of the Indian Ocean, and how research in these areas might be reconfigured so as to develop new research questions and agendas. And in the spirit of my title, I want to now turn to another silent and mention, namely those related to a paper that I co-wrote with Colin Breen, which was published in World Archaeology in 2003. This is not a paper that has been widely cited. Taylor and Francis, who published World Archaeology, list just 14 citations. Google Scholar, around 21. So another silence, perhaps? Especially as some of those are self-citations by either myself or Colin. Perhaps it was not a good paper and didn't warrant publication in the first place, and I can take that on the chin. But let me explain what we were trying to do with that paper at the time we submitted it. First, we were keen to raise the profile of maritime archaeology, at that time a neglected field in East African archaeology. And we wanted to do so in a holistic sense, and not just about underwater archaeology or shipwreck excavations in the region. And we had collaborated on a project around Mombasa Island in 2001, I'll talk to you a little bit about the results in a minute, to this end, and had placed a strong emphasis on training and local capacity building in maritime archaeology as part of that project. But we also wanted to encourage regional archaeologists to think outside the standard framing on coastal archaeology as essentially an archaeology of the origins of the Swahili. And indeed, there has been a huge amount of excellent work. There's a long tradition of research that goes under this portmanteau term of either coastal or Swahili archaeology. But in our looking at the sources that were available for understanding maritime communities and maritime practices along the East African coast, we found that there had been a relative and general neglect by at least the majority of archaeologists of both the periods prior to the emergence of Swahili settlements in terms of how those communities were engaging with the sea, and also with the very obvious archaeology, particularly the monumental archaeology along the East African coast for the post-1500 AD period. there was even also a neglect in Swahili and coastal archaeology at that time on how the majority of Swahili populations had exploited marine resources and engaged with the sea. The focus instead had been very much on the origins of urbanism and Islam, on transoceanic trade, of stone town architecture, and by the 1990s also emphasis in Swahili archaeology was shifting to look at the mud and wattle elements of these towns and coast interior interactions. So we proposed a new way of looking at the archaeological record along the coast in terms of changing seascapes, not tied to particular identities or time periods. This was just a way in which we tried to conceptualize how you might approach an archaeology of the seascape, drawing actually on a model that Toby Parker had developed for maritime Britain. And again, as our emphasis was very much on a holistic maritime archaeology that wasn't just about underwater material, but also what was going on the beach and the foreshore and so forth, and in the distant sea. Now, reflecting on this, I think that if we were to map out an agenda for interpretive themes for new research in the Western Indian Ocean, I would say that one thing that emerged from our Mombasa study was the considerable evidence for the militarization of the landscape after AD 1500. So we argued that if you looked at the pre-Swahili period, maritime, people's engagement with the sea was very much to do with resource extraction and the exploitation of maritime resources. By the late first millennium BC, early first millennium AD, we're beginning to see what one might loosely refer to initial commercialization of the sea, of initial transoceanic exchanges of one sort or another of commodities. We then, from around 1500, get another layer, if you like, a layer of the militarization of the sea, and then subsequent, if you like, globalization of the sea in the sort of 20th century. And we felt that there were a number of themes that might be taken forward, and the rest of my talk I'm going to try and pull out some of these various points. So let's go back to Mombasa and the Mombasa project. The aims were to produce a georeferenced map of the Mombasa port, to integrate the physical characteristics of the landscape through geophysical mapping and coastal survey and recording the bathymetry, with the physical archaeological material traces, ground truthing such anomalies, investigating the underwater sites and so forth. And again, we were keen very much to train and help build local capacity. And again, we were not working from scratch, because, as many of you know, in the 1970s into the early 1980s, there was a long-running and very pioneering wreck excavation project, the Mombasa Wreck, in Mombasa Harbour, that was coordinated by Texas A&M and led by Robin Piercy, who we see here. But that had left a sort of a curious legacy in Kenya. It had left the National Museum with quite a well-resourced conservation lab for dealing with marine finds, but no real actual capacity amongst its archaeologists, its nascent archaeologists, in taking that work any further. And even to this day, the full publication of that site has yet to happen. Now, that's not a critique of any of the people involved, because anybody who's done large-scale wreck excavations will know that it can take an enormous amount of time just to coordinate the conservations of the objects. But when we were discussing the idea of a maritime archaeology project in Mombasa with George Obungu, who was at that time was the director of the National Museums of Kenya, the first thing he said is, "I don't want you lumbering us, if you like, with another bunch of sort of finds that we have to deal with conservation. You know, so it was a bit of a sore point to the National Museums of Kenya that this wonderful excavation had been undertaken, but it had become a bit of a burden without any real sort of potential for taking that forward in the future. What did we do? We did a very rapid desktop survey and you know, sort of walk around with the landscape. And again, we were drawing on methods that Colin's team had developed whilst working in Northern Ireland, and most of the external researchers came from the University of Ulster and Coleraine, where they had, again, only in sort of a few years previously, had they really sort of begun to get European or British archaeologists to think about maritime archaeology to be something more than just shipwreck excavations. And they were so excited when they could see this whole range of very much underutilized pictorial sources of one sort or another, that gave immediately a clear indication of the changing dynamics of Mombasa and Mombasa Harbour. So basically Mombasa's location and its possession of good anchorages made it a target for Portuguese fleets during the course of the 16th century, and it was burned by them on at least 2 occasions. In the early 1590s, the Portuguese made Mombasa a base from which to control the East African trade, and apart from a brief period in 1631 to 2, they dominated affairs there, and at some other points along the Swahili coast, until they were expelled by the Omanis in 1698. A short-term reoccupation occurred from 1728 to 1729, but the Portuguese never managed to regain their hold on the region. But they weren't entering Mombasa that was, you know, an unoccupied space. It was already a thriving settlement, and Sassoon and Kirkman had shown that settlement in the form of a substantial town existed at Mombasa from at least AD 1000, and although subject to change, it continued to flourish until the early 16th century. And at least one other town known as Twaka, so there were towns here and here, it was in existence on the island between the 12th and the 17th century. And a map dated around 1586 by the cartographer André Theve depicts several buildings outside the Mombasa town as well. Interestingly, Theve designates a large structure to the northwest, possibly on Ras Kiberoni, here, as a fortress, probably constructed to guard the northern side of Mombasa Harbour and anchorage. So basically the point was, by looking at these rather neglected historical sources, we could begin to see a whole way in which, looking at the way in which Mombasa's landscape had been transformed, and particularly how it had become increasingly militarised. You can probably catch, as well as the well-known Fort Jesus here, where James Kirkman had done very interesting excavations. We have a fort here, a fort here, a fort here, and as I mentioned, there's a possibility of another fort here. We did some survey and found some very small sort of footings there that might be the remains of this. The Santa Antonio de Tana, or the Mombasa wreck, is also another indication of this sort of increasing militarization of the landscape. But what is also interesting about the wreck of the Mombasa wreck is the nature of its cargo, because the ship, when the ship was sunk, or the cargo it had on it, included local ceramics, and it seems that the ship had been involved in some way, although it was a military vessel, it would also been involved in some exchange and trade along the coast. It was also carrying mangrove poles as well. So we have this sort of integration of the military into the pre-existing trade networks. There is a huge amount of evidence along the East African coast for an increasing militarization of the seascape. Many various forts. These are ones at this is Fort St. Joseph at Mombasa, another small redoubt that the Lions Club in Mombasa very thoughtfully consolidated and repaired. Siu Fort, which is a very interesting fort, it's in Lamu, and it's the only fort actually that had been the Swahili built for themselves, whereas most of the other forts that we find along this coast were constructed by outsiders, including the 18th century Omani Gereza at Kilwa. And probably the only sort of detailed study of, other than James Kirkman's work at Fort Jesus, the only detailed study really has been some work that Mark Horton did on Zanzibar, on the chronological development of the Zanzibar fort. Okay, I want to shift to sort of territory that I'm a little bit more sort of comfortable with, which has to do with, how many minutes have I got? 10? Is the whole potential of exploring commodity chains. And I'm going to use the example of the ivory trade and the related sort of intersection with slave trades in East Africa to illustrate how we might develop a rather different approach to dealing with the historical archaeology of the Indian Ocean, one that is multi-sited from the very outset. And as many of you know, during the 19th century, East Africa became a primary source for elephant ivory. Ivory that was exported to Europe and North America for transformation into a whole variety of new commodities. The Victorian home, if you like, was littered, quite literally, with artifacts made or partly made from ivory. From piano keys to billiard balls to cutlery handles, to ivory fans, etc., etc. This ivory was the plastic of that age, but it was also part and parcel of a new phase of social distinction, a way of marking oneself, of having arrived within the emerging middle class within Victorian society. Ivory was bound up very much with a social aesthetic, with an expression of taste within these societies. And we can track back, if you like, to the source of the ivory and examine the changes both in the social and economic structure of the societies in 19th and possibly late 18th century East Africa, and the ecological consequences of removing elephants on such a scale from these landscapes. And that's what I've been doing in a variety of projects. But I just want to mention also Chap Kusimba's work around Tsavo, where again he has explored in some detail by taking a landscape perspective and looking at the changing distribution of sites, the changes in the faunal compositions of sites in Tsavo, in the immediate hinterland behind Mombasa, from around 1500 through into the 19th century, how we see a shift from a pattern where we have an ethnic mosaic in which different communities, if you like, are integrated within their own economic system, each group providing services for the other. Certainly one that is full of class distinctions, wealth distinctions as well. It's not an egalitarian world in any means at all. The Oromo pastoralists, for example, were extremely powerful individuals who extracted tribute both from the hunters, who were the specialist elephant hunters, but also from the farming populations such as the Taita and Wakamba. And they had sort of, often contested relationships with Swahili merchants on the coast as well. But what we see happening during the 19th century is an increasing, again, an extension of the violence that the militarization of the coast that we begin to see with the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century, an extension of this violence into the interior, such that small communities, such as those living around Mount Kasigai, who had previously been hunter-gathering populations who were able to exploit quite a diverse range of fauna and flora, are increasingly having to they become circumscribed. They're moving into points of refuge on Mount Kassegai. They construct defensive measures in their settlements, and they also have to shift their dietary patterns so that they end up sort of now exploiting only very small game like dik-dik and duikers, and also a whole range of amphibians as well, and that shows up very clearly in the archaeological record. Of course, we shouldn't think about East African populations as simply being, if you like, exploited individuals on the periphery. Jeremy Prestholt's very excellent work on exchange relationships and the way in which East African consumers of imported commodities actually shaped and influenced what was imported will indicate that they had a considerable agency in terms of power over the market. And a former PhD student of mine's work at this 19th century trading halt at Ngombezi, about 50 or so miles inland from Pangani on the East African coast, shows it very well in terms of the shift in the beads that we find within this 2.5–3 meter sequence. And just as Burton and Speke and various other explorers, complain in their reports about how they would arrive in certain communities with sackfuls of beads of one particular colour, only to find that the East African consumers they wished to exchange these with rejected them because those colours were out of fashion. We find a rather similar shift showing up in the archaeological record of these sites. It's not sort of huge dramatic finds. It's not wonderfully spectacular evidence, but it's a whole sort of wealth of archaeological evidence that we find in the East African landscape that until very recently has been largely neglected. What it also does is it links those communities back to, for example, the individuals in Florence who were the producers of the beads. And this was very much a household-based economy. And we know very little, if you like, about, sorry, not Florence, in Venice. We know very little about the archaeological manifestation of this household-based productive strategies. Slavery was an important part of this 19th century slave trade. We know, of course, that slavery is a much older practice, the trade in slaves. We know, particularly from Thomas Vernet's work, historical work on the early Portuguese and French sources, there's very clear evidence of Swahili being involved in the trade of slaves at the time of initial Portuguese contact. But slavery also goes through very, very significant transformations during this 19th century period. There's often a bit of a myth that most of the ivory was taken down to the coast by slaves. Certainly some slaves were involved, but those slaves were not necessarily in the same type of relationship as we imagine for plantation slavery in the United States, for example. The slaves who were involved were perhaps, in the early phase at least, had more rights over themselves and their labour than was ever the case among plantation slaves. But that changes actually, curiously, after the abolition of slavery, and in order for Arab and Swahili elites along the coast to produce products to fit for the legitimate trade, they shift towards the plantation economy, the production of cloves in particular, which require large sums of large amounts of labour. And we see a rise of plantation slavery after the formal abolition of slavery in the region. we know very little, again, about those archaeological sites. We do have some recent work here. This is Lydia Wilson-Marshall's work on maroon settlements. They're beginning to be brought into the discussion. She's done some very interesting work about how these individual maroon sites would fit within the existing population landscape in the hinterland behind Mombasa. So there's a move there towards understanding a little bit more. Similarly, we have a great potential for understanding how towns and the architecture of towns along the East African coast become somewhat hybridized as you have these very multi-ethnic communities growing up along the various East African ports through which the ivory is channeled and then sent out to sent across to Zanzibar for export to around the world. And Pangani is perhaps one area that's really crying out for some really detailed study of the fusing of different architectural styles and architectural traditions in the house design, house layout and so forth, where we have Indian, Arab, Swahili, Omani, and subsequently also German European styles all being blended together. And it's a remarkably well preserved, if you like, heritage landscape that has fortunately escaped because it became a backwater. It escaped all of the sort of ravages of the sort of coastal development that we've seen in the late 20th century along the East African coast and all of the hotel building. So in a sense, it's an area of real importance that should be given, invested time and energy and attention to the preservation of that, the maintenance of that, but a preservation in a way that doesn't transform this into some sort of Disneyland heritage town. It's a living town. How do you sustain those communities, allow them to continue to use and utilize these buildings, but also revive the architectural skills that would facilitate the maintenance, long-term maintenance of these buildings? It's a major challenge of facing us. I've done it again. I did it yesterday. There you go. I'm going to skip this one very quickly. I just want to throw up the fact that once we start following the commodities, and in this case ivory, this is from I think it's the St. George wreck off Goa, we begin to see the connectedness of these worlds. So we begin to see the various different actors who are involved in the various processes. There's been some excellent work on the underwater archaeology around Goa, but much less on the towns itself, on the Portuguese and later heritage of that town. This ivory is very interesting because it's been analysed in terms of its geographical origins, and this comes from a wreck off Goa, and it appears to have come from elephants that were killed in Mozambique. And for those who don't know, Goa became during the Portuguese period, a centre of the production of a particular style of Indian Christian or Goan Christian religious artifacts of one sort or another, crucifixes and other forms, all from ivory as well. So perhaps these bits of ivory and the hippopotamus tusks were destined for this. I've talked about this before in Stanford, and Ali Kelly has been researching this for a PhD, but I'm going to sort of rush through this a bit because time is running out. But I'm just saying that we can, by thinking about where the commodity goes, it's like that sort of adage in police work, and of course we know that archaeology is very much about a detective story really, and understanding. You follow the crime, and you follow the commodity. So here we have the ivory reaching the UK and being used in the 19th century cutlery industry, and we have evidence here of the different organisation and the production and the processing of ivory to make the various products that were then sold to the Victorian world. Really interestingly, 75% of the ivory that's imported into the United States in the 19th century just goes to two little towns in Connecticut, to and to 2 companies. So it says 90% here, so maybe that's as much. Pratt Reed and Comstock. And even this place called Iveryton, it was a tiny little hamlet, wasn't called Iveryton in the turn of the 19th century, and suddenly, owing to the development of a very a mechanized way of cutting ivory, it was invented by a goldsmith here of the name of Phineas Pratt, who then becomes one of the owners of these companies. The whole place takes off, and it attracts a huge amount of labour into that part of Connecticut, which of course now is shifted back into a rather little sleepy sort of, not suburbia, but sort of sleepy, Connecticut, wealthy Connecticut towns, where the heritage again survives and is very well recognised in the sort of the local consciousness as well. But it's trying to connect. Iveryton in Connecticut has connections, direct connections with those communities that are found where we've excavated sites along the Pangani River. And I'll just end on this last one because I know time is running out. This is my favourite slide, and it's again an area where I feel that we have so much scope and opportunity by thinking about commodity chains and how we can develop a multi-sited archaeology with teams that are working on different continents at either end of these commodity chains, on both the social consequences of that, the material aesthetic consequences of the flows of those commodities, the economic changes that they trigger, the ecological consequences. And this is the Naumkeag steam cotton mill. And this is the very first steam-powered cotton factory in the United States. It's a fundamental monument or site where it doesn't exist as a monument anymore. It burnt down in 1914, and today it's now, there's a large warehouse is built over the site. But this is, if you like, this place here is the start, or a part of the start of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, driven by the engagement in the ivory trade, because one of the most important commodities that East African consumers wanted was cotton cloth. Americani cloth was produced from here, and it became the favoured type of cotton cloth amongst East African consumers. And of course that had then consequences on the other side of the Indian Ocean, in India, and triggered significant collapse to the Indian cotton industry that had previously been the primary source of cotton for the trade between East Africa and other parts of the Indian Ocean. I think you've been very kind to me.